Hello and welcome to the Books Uncovered podcast, a podcast brought to you by Fulcrum Publishing, where we explore the world of books and the people who make up the publishing and the book world. I'm Sam Shinta, publisher of Fulcrum Publishing, and I'm joined by my co-host, Kateri Kramer, Fulcrum's marketing director. Hi, Kateri, how are you today?
I'm doing well. I'm in kitty land. I adopted a kitty over the weekend, so I'm sleep deprived a little bit, but very, very smitten with her.
It's like having a new child.
It kind of is, actually. I didn't realize it. She doesn't sleep through the night yet. So,
is she there with you today?
She is.
Is she there with you?
She's sleeping on her little cat tree. Thank goodness, finally.
Okay, wonderful. I understand spring is finally starting to arrive in the Rocky Mountains, which is great. So congratulations on that. A few weeks past due.
Yes, yeah, it is a little bit. But I think we're in the home stretch here. Hopefully no more snow. So it's
in Colorado,
the same way in Wisconsin.
Yeah, we had snow a couple of weeks ago, and then it was really, really cold. And now today it's just about 75 and sunny, and things are blooming. I was out in the garden, and things are popping up, and it's just so wonderful to see life begin anew, which is so wonderful. And I'm looking out at all of these trees, lots and lots and lots of trees, which I did intentionally so that I could make the setting perfect for our wonderful guest today. So our guest today is Joan Maloof. And Joan is a writer, ecologist, and conservationist with a unique voice in today's environmental movement. She has published numerous research articles and written several books, including Nature's Temples and The Living Forest. Joan Maloof is also the founder of the Old Growth Forest Network, an organization that works to protect forests across the United States, and she travels widely to educate others on forest preservation. Welcome, Joan Maloof. How are you doing today?
Hi, thank you for having me. Having a great day here.
Well, Joan, it's so great to see you today. And so let's talk a little bit about your area of expertise and your passion. What exactly is an old growth forest, and why should we care about those?
An old growth forest is one that's never been cut down, which you might think that there's a lot of them around, but we were pretty efficient at cutting down all the forests. So there's very few of those forests left, only 1% in the East and 5% in the West. And the reason to care about them is because as a forest gets older and older, it develops more complexity. And that complexity is reflected in the number of species that live there. So the old growth forests have a lot of biodiversity in them because of their structure, and they also hold a lot of carbon because the trees can get so large. And also, to me, they are the most beautiful forests.
And so let's maybe talk the United States with these. Where are most of these old growth forests concentrated? Are they across the continent? Are they concentrated in certain parts of the country?
Well, the middle of our country is a lot of prairie and we have a lot of desert. So there's, of course, not many forests there. The forests are concentrated on the East Coast and in the Pacific Northwest. On the East Coast, most of the old growth forests that remain are in the Adirondacks of New York or in the Smoky Mountains in the South. And then there's important bits around too in Pennsylvania, like Cook Forest and Congaree in South Carolina. And in the West, Pacific Northwest, there are a lot of forests in Oregon and Washington and Northern California that are the old growth forests there.
And are these forests let's use the word endangered? Are we in danger of possibly taking them for granted or starting to see a decline in their numbers over the last several years?
Well, they've been endangered for generations, really. For hundreds of years, we've been hacking away at them. And this is what really encouraged me to begin my work. When we got down to such a small amount, I realized that we couldn't let our last bits of old growth forest go. We needed to make sure that they were protected for all times. And in fact, that we should let some other forests get older again instead of being cut. So they were in danger, and even the federal government was cutting some of our old growth forests in the national forest. But just recently, there's been kind of a change in the political climate around these forests. And finally, the federal government is starting to take notice and inventory where the old growth forests are. And we're hoping that that will lead to stronger protections. But in the meantime, it's just up to people who really care.
I noticed last week there was a story that Kelly, our producer, shared with us that apparently the Biden administration has plans to protect 112 million acres, I think that was, of old growth forests, that this is becoming a priority. Is this a new piece of legislation or in response to some threats?
So last year and on Earth Day, President Biden made an executive order for the first time asking his administrations, so the Forest Service and BLM, to define old growth and inventory the old growth. And he gave them 1 year. So this year, right before Earth Day, he came out with the results of that. And we're hoping that that will now lead to an actual rulemaking order that will protect those forests. But that piece hasn't been done yet. So if any of your listeners are politically active at all, this would be a great time to tell the White House that we want those old growth forests protected.
Now, let's maybe talk a little bit about the Old Growth Forest Network. When did you found the organization? And what motivated you to get into this?
Yeah, so that grew out of books that I wrote. My first book was called Teaching the Trees, and a chapter in that book was called Old Growth Air, because I visited an old growth forest in Maryland, the closest one that I could find. And I was just amazed at the quality of the air and how beautiful it was. And as a result of that book being published, people kept asking me where the forest was. They all wanted to see an old growth forest. And I realized that there was no inventory of old growth forests in the East that could tell people where they could go to see these forests that were open to the public. So I realized I should write another book. And that was called Among the Ancients, where I traveled to one old growth forest in each of the eastern states, so the 26 states east of the Mississippi, visited an old growth forest in each one, told exactly how to get there, and talked about the special nature of old growth forests and the threats to old growth forests. And it was on those journeys, Sam, that I realized this fact that they're still endangered. They're so rare and they're still endangered. And then I said, we need an organization that's going to protect them. And it came to me all of a sudden, this is going to be the Old Growth Forest Network. We're going to make sure that there's at least one in each county where forests can grow, that's protected and open to the public. So that was the start of the mission. I had the idea in 2007 while writing that second book, but I didn't actually jump in and start creating the organization until 2011.
I was just looking at the map on the website, and it's really interesting because you're right, like things are sort of clustered on like the coasts, which because I'm in Colorado, I was like, well, we have lots of forests, and like Montana and Wyoming and even New Mexico and bits of Utah and stuff do, but it looks like there's one in Utah and one in Colorado. Mm-hmm. And they're both kind of like maybe along the same latitude line even. What's the reason that like these Western Rocky Mountain states have fewer old growth forests than the two coasts?
Well, really right now, that just comes down to where we have the connections. So since I live in Maryland on the East Coast, I know a lot of people here, and I get invited to give book talks and to talk to garden clubs and talk about the organization. And so we get volunteers, we call them county coordinators, a volunteer in each county that are out there looking for the best old growth forest in their county. And I lived in 2016, 2017 in California, made a lot of connections out there. Mm-hmm. And also California is pretty famous for its conservation ethic. And so it was easy to put those forests in the network, but in the middle part of the country, I didn't have that many connections. And so I'm hoping to grow them. So last week I was just in Montana giving a talk and trying to get more volunteers out there, because you're right, Kat, there's lots of beautiful forests in the Rocky Mountains in the middle parts of the country that we look forward to adding to the old growth forest network. Right now, we have just over 200 forests in the network in 33 states. That's right. And so that's why there's just like one in Colorado and one in Utah, because we were trying to get one in each state as quickly as possible before we fill in.
For the lay person who's just out hiking and maybe they're like not a trained naturalist, but are outside a lot, and what are the like identifiable characteristics where they can be like, is this an old growth forest or not?
Mm-hmm. Well, the most common one we think of is big trees, right? And so that can also confuse people if they're expecting all the trees to be big, because they're not. In an old growth forest, you may have some large trees, but you'll have medium trees and small trees. And sometimes an old growth forest, the trees won't even be that large, even though they're very old. The characteristic that I use most is by looking up at the canopy. And the canopies in the very old trees are unique once you know what to look for. They have almost like an antler shape, and the branches are kind of curvy. They're going this way and that way. They're not very regular like the trees you draw in third grade. So they have this strange curvy structure. Also by the bark, that's another way I tell that trees tend to get thicker and thicker bark as they age. And then depending on the species, sometimes when they get old enough, over 100, they'll start doing what's called balding. So tulip poplar trees, oak trees, the bark at a certain point will get thinner. Also, you'll see a lot of big or older trees that have fallen to the ground. We call that coarse woody debris. And that's normal. That's a positive sign, because that's an important part of the ecology in the forest, that dead wood. And other than that, it's just a sort of a complexity. You'll see lots of different layers, you'll see gaps. And to me, it has kind of a special feel. So you may be hiking along and all of a sudden you'll think, oh, something's different about this forest. And you may be in an old growth forest.
Oh, that's really cool. Because I think a lot of people who spend time outdoors maybe like are in tune enough to feel that, but they don't know why that difference is there. Mm-hmm. Which, yeah, that's very interesting. Is a virgin forest the same as an old growth forest?
Yes.
Okay, just a different name.
Yeah, a new term. And sometimes they're called primary forests as well, or ancient forests. So a lot of different terminology.
I just love what Joan was saying about this whole idea of fallen trees. I was reading in the beginning of Nature's Temple, that Nature's Temples, that you talk about this whole idea that, the trees that fall and rot and become just so elemental to so much of life in the forest. So many of us, when we walk, right, we see a fallen tree and we think, oh, that's too bad, a dead tree. Mm-hmm. And maybe they'll come and cut it up and haul it away. But it is essential to the forest and the forest regenerating itself and sustaining all of this life. What sort of life it depends on dead trees and deadfall?
I like to say that there's more life in a dead tree than there is in a living tree. And it's very true. There are so many types of life. One of the types of life are beetles. There are certain beetles that burrow into the wood and they actually eat the wood. And they have special bacteria and nematodes in their gut that then can digest the wood like termites do. And these beetles that can be quite large, over an inch long, they're called patent leather beetles or Mary Jane beetles because they look like the old-fashioned shiny black children's shoes. And they live in family groups. There's like a spouse or partners and young ones that they take care of and feed. But those beetles then soften the wood so that the fungi can grow in there. Many different types of fungi are growing in there. And then you'll have other organisms that feed on the fungi, insects that feed on the fungi. And then there are lizards and salamanders that will go through the cavities in the wood looking for the beetles and eating the beetles. And then, of course, the animals that eat the lizards and the salamanders. And then that's not even mentioning that the algae and the mushrooms that live on the wood. So many, many types of organisms. And the wood in an old growth forest is special because if those trees were large, then you're going to have very large dead trees that take a long time to decompose. And those dead trees are going to stay warmer in the winter and they're going to stay cooler and damper in the summer. So they're a good habitat for many creatures.
That's super interesting. Are things like not human caused things a threat to old growth forests as well? Like I'm thinking beetle kill or forest fires, or is that just part of the forest's like natural life cycle? Will it still potentially harm an old growth forest's like standing as an old growth forest? I'm not sure what the terminology is, but how do those like non-human factors play in?
Well, the old growth forest habitat is very changeable, I'll put it that way. So there are ice storms that will come in, there are fires that will come through, there are insects that will affect certain species. But in the long run, because the forests tend to be so diverse and made up of all kinds of different age classes, they tend to recover from those disturbances more quickly than if it was a monoculture type forest. So think about forest fires. Yes, a forest fire can go through an old growth forest and do a lot of damage, but there'll be a lot of carbon still held in those trunks, and that carbon can be used to be the basis of the ecosystem for recovery, and a lot of seeds still in the ground and a lot of resprouting will happen. A lot of insects will be there moving things. And it's the same way with insect infestations. They usually just affect one species. So that species might go down and another species will take its place. In an old growth forest also, it's natural to have this slow death rate that allows for these light gaps in the canopy. And that's another indicator of old growth forests and is very important, that complexity.
Yeah. I'm curious, because you've done so much writing about forests and ecosystems and conservation, what do you feel is the role of the author and writing within the larger conservation world?
I started out as a scientist and I didn't imagine that I was going to be a writer, but as a scientist, an ecologist, when I saw what was happening to the forest, I thought, how can I make a difference? And it seemed like the science alone wasn't making enough of a difference. So I decided to start writing so that I could bring that science to the general public, so I could let people know the results of these experiments and these studies. And it has made a much more of a difference, I believe, than my science, because it reaches more people, and then it also gives me a platform from which to share the ideas. As I said, because I have books, I'll get invited to these groups to give talks. So while I'm there, I can talk to them about how important it is to save the forests. So the books have been an important doorway for me to reach people, and even podcasts like this. If I didn't have books, I wouldn't be invited to speak and share here. So they've made a difference.
What have you found? Because you mentioned that you start as a scientist and become an ecologist and then become a writer of the natural world. What have you found have been the biggest challenges or challenge to that transition of again, working in the scientific world where everything is very controlled and precise, and now going into more of a creative universe, as it were?
Yes, well, I actually retired from my university teaching job. I was teaching biology and environmental studies to start the Old Growth Forest Network. And that seemed doable, and that was a way that I could keep writing and start a nonprofit. But then it grew from there. As the Old Growth Forest Network got more popular, we started speaking out for threatened forests. And that's kind of like social work. It's like there's no end to that. There's always a forest somewhere, especially because we're a national organization that needs to be saved. And so I found that it did spread me a little thin. But luckily, people have been very generously donating to the Old Growth Forest Network, so we could continue to add a few people to the staff and spread out the workload. And just recently this year, I retired from the executive director position, and my title is founder, and I keep speaking and I keep writing because I think those are the important roles for me, while our wonderful director, Sarah, can keep the organization going and keep the forest network growing too.
You mentioned before, and I certainly don't want to miss this point because I think it's important, and you hit it a couple of times subtly, this idea that these old growth forests are in essence huge carbon sinks, that they really are a huge factor in our combating climate change issues. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the role that they play and why that is so important?
Sure. Well, most people understand, but just in case, very simply, when we take these fuels out of the ground, like oil and natural gas, and we burn them, they release carbon dioxide. I mean, that's natural. We release carbon dioxide when we burn the fuels that we eat. But because we're taking this carbon out of the ground, they call fossil fuels, it's been increasing the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Well, trees love carbon dioxide. It's like candy to them. Well, they can't live without it. They're always taking it in through the pores in their leaves because they need it for photosynthesis. And after photosynthesis, that carbon dioxide is turned into a molecule that can be used for energy, or it can be used to build the wood in the tree. So they're taking carbon dioxide out of the air, literally, and building the wood in the trees and storing it there. The forests are taking in about a third of the excess carbon dioxide that we're releasing into the atmosphere. So they're doing a pretty good job. But the problem is we're not only continually releasing more fossil fuels, but we're continually cutting down the trees and releasing that carbon into the atmosphere. So the harvesting of trees releases 5 times more carbon dioxide than all these other things we're talking about, like fires and windstorms and insects. So we have control over that. So if we're serious about bringing down the carbon dioxide levels, we need to allow the forest to keep standing and store that carbon.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, it's so fascinating. So it's both leave them there to absorb the carbon, or if we cut them down, it makes the problem even worse. So
Exactly.
this whole idea that these old growth forests really are a big factor in how we as a species continue.
Yes, exactly. And I know we do need some wood. You know, I'm not against all harvesting, but I find that we're not very careful with the wood that we do harvest. There's not enough reuse or recycling. I think we could do better and leave more forest standing.
It's interesting you say that. I had the good fortune at one point to go to Indonesia at one time, and I was in Borneo, and we were going upriver in Borneo with some members of the Dayak, who are the indigenous people of Borneo. And some of the people I was traveling with were noting with dismay the clear cutting of all of those mostly teak wood forests, very great hardwood and giant forests. And one of the Dayak looked at the of course American typical Westerner and said, "Well, who do you think is buying all of this wood to make things? You know, this, how dare you? If the demand wasn't there, you know, what do you think might happen?" And it was really a good moment to see, like, oh, wait a second, yeah, maybe
Yeah.
maybe we need to be a little bit more practical in the things that we use and
Yes.
the woods that we purchase.
Right. What you decide to make your deck out of makes a difference.
Yeah, Trex was a wonderful invention. All of these composites are wonderful inventions.
Mm-hmm.
And this whole idea of creating, I know there's a movement afoot of these sustainable forests, right, with more sustainable woods like bamboo and the like, things that grow faster and that we can then use in a variety of applications as well.
Yes, you know, when we look at what are some of the solutions, you know, we do need fiber and wood. I think I've come to the conclusion that we need more of these forests that have already been destroyed. They're like crop forests, or we call them industrial forests, and just look at them almost like cornfields. Like, we've ruined this ecosystem, but let's just keep these trees growing and harvest them when we need to. But in the meantime, do not cut our native forests that still have the biodiversity. Maybe they've been cut once, but they're in recovery. We need those forests to not only store the carbon, but for the biodiversity they hold. It would be awful, in my estimation, to convert those native forests to the industrial crop forests. And that's what's continuing to happen as we start to think of forests as just one big general green thing. Oh, forests. So we have to really look at the type of forest. Is it, how old is it? How diverse is it? Where is it located?
What are like 2 or 3 things that the average person can do to make either lifestyle changes or get involved and help not just old growth forests, but any forest that's in their community?
Mm-hmm. Well, if they're fortunate enough to live in a forested part of the world, I like to say, just look around where you live, your town, your community, your area, and try to find the oldest forest there. Now, it doesn't have to be a park that's open to the public. Just start being aware. Where are the biggest trees, the oldest trees? And then try to find out who owns that forest. And then somehow, perhaps, what their plans are for the forest, and if there's any way that you could help protect the forest, maybe encouraging them to put a conservation easement on the forest, or if they ever sell that forest, to have them sell it to the city or county or state and become a park. Because what happens so often is the oldest forests in an area are targeted by the forestry industry. And you don't know who owns the forest. You don't know anything about the forest, but then you come by and that forest has been cut down. because in many cases, the owners of the forest didn't realize what they had. They didn't understand. So we've got to all take it upon ourselves to try to save the last of these forests in our community.
Are a lot of old growth forests on private land?
Yes, they are, but we don't have any idea really how many. We haven't done an inventory. This inventory that Biden asked for recently was the first inventory ever done on federal lands, if you can believe it.
Wow.
So we still don't have an inventory on private land, although with the satellite and LIDAR and things, that may be coming down the line in the future.
Well, you've had a wonderful career, again, as scientist, ecologist, activist, and now writer. Do you have a favorite role that you've played, or are they all just equally rewarding?
Oh, wow. That's a tough one. I think it's a really nice balance. That the activism is so rewarding when you're actually able to save a forest. There's nothing that feels better than walking through a forest that you've helped save. And I'm so honored that I've helped save many of them. But on the same hand, there's nothing more crushing than knowing that a forest got cut that shouldn't have been cut. I still hold a couple of them in my heart, wishing I could have done more. So the writing is a good balance to that. I can expound on both of those feelings in the writing. And I love how the books, they stay and they continue to talk to people year after year after year. So we're all on our own trajectory. So it may be somebody just this year is discovering how much they love forests and how much it means to them. So they can read a book that I wrote in 2007, and it'll be just like it's coming to them for the first time.
And you talked about things that we can do, which I really appreciate, that this whole idea of there are these everyday actions. Do you feel optimistic and hopeful about the future of old growth forests in America?
I do. Maybe it's just because I have an optimistic personality, but and maybe it's because I'm always talking to people who love trees. I look out at my audiences and there's all these people who love trees and it feels great. But I feel like that group is growing. I feel like more and more people are understanding how important the forests are for the ecology. And even the fact that it reached the executive branch of the government, the president of the United States saying old growth forests are important. I never imagined that would happen when I started the organization. And it does give me optimism.
Well, that's wonderful. And, it is just so great that you have had this wide-ranging career where you've worked with students, where you've worked with the general public, where you've, I'm sure, influenced politicians, policymakers, and now through your reading, just the general public. Which brings us to my favorite segment of every episode, where we talk about books. And in our Hey, What You Reading section this week, we're talking about books that have had the biggest influence on your thinking about conservation and stewardship. And so I think you had a couple. Is that correct, Joan?
Yes. One of the people that's really influenced me in this process is John Muir. And it was his writing that actually helped to preserve Yosemite Park, and he was able to camp with the president under a sequoia tree and convince the president why we needed to have this be a national park. And so many of the old growth redwoods that we can visit today is because of John Muir's writing. And by the way, we share the same initials too. So I don't have a particular John Muir book. There's a lot of his writings that have been edited together, but I would put him forward as a role model. And then beyond John Muir, more recently, before I even wrote my first book, which was Among the Ancients, I read a book called Strangely Like War by Derek Jensen. And that encapsulated what was going on with our forests, how there was this corporate industrial machine that was cutting them down, and that the people that were trying to save the forests didn't have as much power, and how difficult it was. And that one really influenced me, and I think made me start thinking that I needed to be more active in forest preservation. And then we know a little bit about the devastating history of the old growth forests in our country, that when the European settlers came here, we had mostly old growth forests. Things had naturally happened to it, but we had a lot of old growth forests, but we just started cutting it down immediately. The European settlers exporting the timber, using it for everything from homes to ships to railroads, until we have this meager amount left. But the book American Canopy by Eric Rutkow really lays that story out chapter by chapter, and you can realize how quickly and thoroughly we cut the forest. So those were some that have influenced me.
Oh, those are excellent recommendations. I have another book by Derek Jensen. I can't remember the title offhand, but I know him as a good writer. So those are terrific recommendations.
Yeah.
How about you, Kateri?
I chose two this time. One fiction and actually one nonfiction. So the first is the nonfiction book. It's called Limber by Angela Pelster. I always get her last name wrong. And this book I partly chose because it is about trees, but it was, I think, one of the first collections of essays that I read and it's not like explicitly in the conservation space, but I would say it's considered more nature writing, but it's one of the first books that I read that I felt like this emotional connection to the outdoors in a very specific way. Like I was crying over a tree story in this book. And it's really beautifully written. They're pretty short essays, kind of hybrid in nature, cover lots of different types of trees. And it's just very, very good. So that's my first one. Second one is also kind of peripherally about trees. This is the fiction one. It's called Lanny. It's by Max Porter. It's not necessarily a plot-driven book, so I'm not going to try to explain what goes on, but it's about this little boy's connection with his local forest and kind of the experiences that he has growing up there, and this idea that there's a forest spirit that lives there and kind of cares for him. And just another book that made me feel very emotionally attached to a specific area. I think once you have that emotional attachment, the conservation and the activism comes pretty naturally. So Lanny and Limber were my two choices. What about you, Sam?
Well, I did not go with tree books because I just started thinking about this, and I've read so many books on conservation over the years. I just can't even begin to make a list. So I just had to go with an obvious choice and then more of a recent choice. So the obvious choice, I love the John Muir choice because he was originally from Wisconsin, and I'm going to pick another of Wisconsin's own, Aldo Leopold, of course, Sand County Almanac. That book and his discussion of the land ethic have just been so instrumental to so much of what I've done in my life, and the way that he was able to marry ethics and conservation and stewardship together. It's so influential on the way that we look at conservation today. And also this idea, and what I've always loved about Leopold is that conservation is a big tent project, that we have to bring together a variety of people that use the land in order to actually save the land and to have a healthy land. So he's the obvious one for me, but that's a book I revisit very frequently. And then the other, the writer, probably the contemporary writer on what I would call the natural world, and as a result, conservation, that I really enjoy the most is Robert Macfarlane out of Great Britain. So Macfarlane has written a bunch of books, The Old Ways, Landmarks. His last book, Underland, a deep time journey, is actually, it was wonderful because it was like the flip of the forest. It's okay, what happens underground, and how do we humans connect with what happens below the surface? Because we're so often focusing on above the surface, and of course that's wonderful and important, but there's so much of a great world under our feet as well. And I just love how he brings together the interaction of humans and the natural world in such an elegant and beautifully written way. So I would say he's the one I just enjoy, and again, go back to his writings frequently as well.
That's great, Sam. I look forward to reading that one because there's so little we know about the ecology underground.
Oh, you'll love, yeah, it is a beautiful, beautiful book, well written. And there are parts of it that it's, he will talk about the human stuff that we've developed underground, but then also the natural stuff. But this whole world that is just there, right below our feet.
And mentioning in the fiction space with tree books, of course, the Overstory.
Of course, yes, of course.
And another one, Baron in the Trees.
The Italo Calvino. Yes.
So good.
Wonderful book. Yeah,
so
that
is. I love that one.
That's one of the few books I still have from my high school years that I still carry with me all these years later.
You'll reread it again. You'll love it. And Kateri, when you mentioned that story about loving a space and how it'll give you the energy for activism, there's a very little known book by Wendell Berry called Jayber Crow. And
I love Wendell Berry.
Captured that so well. There's an old growth forest in that story they call the nest egg.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Part of the story.
I'll add that to my list of many, many books I need to read.
Yes, and I will pull my Calvino off the shelf. I haven't read that in a number of years, so that would be great.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Joan Maloof, this has just been terrific, inspiring, and I always love when folks come on and they force us to go out and want to explore the natural world a little bit. So the Old Growth Forest Network, where can people find out about that? What's the website?
oldgrowthforest.net. And you click on Find a Forest, and we have, as I said, 200 forests across the country that are all open to the public and relatively accessible. So get out there, explore, enjoy the forests, and it's going to feed your soul and make you want to preserve more of them.
And of course, Nature's Temples in a new edition from Princeton University Press, correct?
That's correct.
And available at bookstores across the country.
All the places. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Joan Maloof, thank you for joining us and sharing your energy and your wonderful insights with us today.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Kateri.
It was nice to meet you.
Thank you.